Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us from across the country and around the world for this evening's talk, Black Botany, a conversation with the curators. I am Raquel Nazario, Chief Diversity Officer for the Garden, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speakers. So let me set the stage. In 2019, Rashad Bell, a Black American Collections Maintenance Associate at the LuEsther T Mertz Library, and Nuala, an Irish immigrant completing a fellowship in the Humanities Institute, asserted their collective agency to compose an exhibition that amplified the botanical contributions and knowledge of Black people by delving into the history of 5 common and widely used plants. Rashad holds a BA in English and Film from Cleveland State University and a Master's of Library and Information Science from Kent State University. Nuala is a PhD candidate in the History Department at NYU and a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. Together, they utilize the Mertz Library, which houses the world's largest collection of research material about plant, science, and horticulture, as a resource for the exhibit Black Botany, the Nature of Black Experience. As you are about to discover, this exhibit offers a unique way to acknowledge the complex relationship between enslaved Black people, nature, and the colonial environment, and reconsider the conscious omission of Black knowledge of the natural world. Today's conversation is part of a series of virtual programs that celebrate Black excellence and highlights the many contributions of Black botanists, horticulturalists, artists, and educators to botanical arts and sciences. Before we begin, I encourage you to participate in today's event by using the chat button if you want to comment during the presentation, or directly posing a question to our speakers using the Q&A feature. To enable live captions in English, click the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen and click on live transcription. Also, if you see an interesting question pop up in the Q&A, you can like it and help it move to the top of the question board. Our education team is facilitating things behind the scenes. So we're about to find out about our curators process and if it was kismet. It is my great pleasure to hand it over to the Black Botany curators, Rashad and Nuala.
Hi, everybody. I'm just waiting for, there he is. Hi, Rashad.
Hey, Nuala, sorry, my video wouldn't start. Sorry, everyone. Thank you, Raquel, for that excellent intro. We're super, super excited to be able to speak about this exhibition. I just want to give a big thank you to the Education Department and to NYBG for this opportunity. Thank you to everyone in attendance. I'm not sure where you all are, but we're sitting here in New York City within Lenapehoking, the homelands of the Lenape peoples. For today's talk, we're going to walk you through how this collaboration emerged, the ways we approach creating this exhibition, and we're hoping to open up a discussion about decolonizing scientific museums. While we're here to celebrate Black excellence, we wish to acknowledge that every month is Black History Month, and every day we are thankful for the indigenous cultures of this land. Hand it over to Nuala to get the story started.
Thank you so much to the Education Department and to the New York Botanic Gardens for this invite, and to all of you for attending. There's so many options, so I appreciate your time coming. So we're like absolutely thrilled to be able to actually share with you our sort of journey on creating Black Botany exhibition. So what we want you to do is sit back, and we want to plant this in the back of your mind. Here you have in front of you a Black American librarian and a white Irish academic, and I hope we don't have to point out who's who. Now, if this was the 19th century, right, way back when, 19th century America, these two cultures would have been pitted against each other. Both groups were outsiders, but for very different reasons. Over time, these two cultures diverged. The Irish became insiders in American culture. They became celebrated and considered American. As the decades wore on, the Irish became deeply embedded in the halls of power. So think about who's in the White House right now. I know you're all thinking of Harris, but I'm talking about Biden. As scores and scores of new groups of immigrants actually came to this shore, they moved up and into society. However, African Americans remained outsiders. They were pushed to the periphery in ways that parallel and overlap significantly with the experience of Indigenous cultures as colonialism and empire transformed into the modern world. The doors to power remained firmly guarded, predominantly by gatekeeping white men towards people of color. Our story revolves around access and who gets to tell these stories and why. As you may have noticed, museums and other cultural institutions are in the public eye, and it's not particularly good stuff. As the globe gets smaller and people visit cities and new countries, and we're all hoping that we can travel again soon, cultural institutions may be on our top 10 attractions to see. It cannot be underestimated the power that these institutions have to present visions of not just nature, but of humans. For so long, cultural institutions have been protected by a veil. This veil is science, that science is neutral. Science has stood on this platform of objectivity for centuries, and certain interpretations of humans and nature have produced some of the most single-sided, resilient narratives at times that seem so utterly natural as to not have a moment in time where someone literally sat down and invented and constructed them. And many of these stories we're grappling with today. As a plant scientist who shifted into the history of science, I was always struck by how the plant world kind of got a free pass when it came to colonialism. And I often wondered why. And I think the scholar Ventina Blackburn sort of explains it so eloquently. So I quote, "Whiteness is not personal. A white person is not whiteness itself. Whiteness is institutional." End quote. While it's really tempting to think of botanical museums and gardens as neutral spaces of wellness and education, the question always comes with that, for whom exactly? We were curious, myself and Rashad, to know in what ways do race, gender, class, capitalism, and colonialism actually intersect with botanical spaces. We knew that they weren't neutral, but we wanted to know in what ways. If zoological museums are being forced to reckon with their uncomfortable past, how can botanical museums do the same? So where do we start to understand this role of botanical science, botany, gardening, horticulture in denying people their political and historical natures? A recent article from a scientist at the New York Botanic Gardens demonstrates how the legacy of colonialism still pervades today. So I'm going to quote just a little bit, not the whole piece, but some aspects of field work do not seem to have changed in a century, as some expeditions still entail long travel, with 2 or 3 porters for each botanist to help carry all the gear and specimens. End quote. This excerpt highlights how local labor is used to assist Western scientists in their research. But if you step back from this statement, you can see that the exploitative nature of contemporary expeditions today, they involve porters, local people that are nameless, cultureless, utilized for labor and not as collaborators per se, and in most cases not as knowledge makers. There is little difference in the approach to plant collecting and expeditions between today and the past. But I know you're sitting there and you're like asking, but what exactly is decolonization? So outside of sort of fever spasms and knee-jerk reactions that this term can cause people in power, decolonization actually has a very long history, understandably. Decolonization emerged into the public consciousness in the 1940s when theorists such as Suzanne César and her husband Aimé, Leopold Sédar Senghor, and Frantz Fanon first articulated the Black condition in the world and offered a vision of a decolonized world. And since then, the actual term decolonization, whether it's a museum or a collection or a narrative, has been hotly debated. Recently, the Washington Post defined it as, and I quote, "a process that institutions undergo to expand the perspectives they portray beyond those of the dominant cultural group, particularly white colonizers," end quote. In other words, decolonization is both a movement and an ideology to acknowledge, examine, challenge, and eliminate the disproportionate legacy of white European thought. So in a nutshell, it's about decentering white supremacy over the world, and particularly the natural world. This bleaching out of history is actually where our story began. So one of our broad aims, when myself and Rashad were talking about doing this kind of an exhibit, was to begin to force a conversation about decolonization at the gardens and elsewhere. In other words, To quote somebody, this is a very American reference, so I apologize to anyone who's not from the United States. In other words, we wanted to grab white supremacy by the botany. And over to you, Rashad.
Thank you, Nuala. So I'm going to tell you guys a little story. One day in late January of last year, that's before the world changed significantly, there was a librarian and an academic. The librarian was working in the library stacks and bumped into the academic. She was researching the ebony tree. Her work focuses on conservation, science, ideology, and policy in 19th and 20th century Madagascar. And supposedly there's one small grove of ebony trees left on the land. She looked up ebony in the library catalog, and the first book on the list at the time was God's Ebony Scientist by Basil Miller, written in 1943. Catalog algorithms are designed to filter results into particular categories, but this, even for a keyword search, seemed beyond the pale. The plant Nuala was interested in called up a book with an odd title that entangled religion, science, and a Black man. While working in the stacks, I bumped into Nuala, and she shared this very odd entry with me. I went and got the book. We began to chat about it and skim the pages. Nuala asked me what the garden was doing for Black History Month, and I wasn't sure. But I told her that Black History Month seemed to get less attention than compared to when I was younger. As we talked, we thought, why don't we do something? We spoke to the director of the library, Susan Fraser, and the director of the Humanities Institute, Vanessa Sellers, and they said yes. So once we had the approval, we had to figure out what we were going to do and our goals. So what was our aim? We wanted to celebrate Black History Month at MYBG, like simple as that, because we noticed there was a void. So I'm proud to be Black, and I'm also proud to be a librarian. Anyone knows me knows that I will talk about these two things a lot. That said, only one of those things was a choice. I didn't go to school to be Black. In my mind, I'd be failing at both of these things if I didn't follow through with this opportunity. So to celebrate Black History Month at the Gardens, we wanted to highlight Black culture and Black excellence within a botanical frame. We wanted to create an interdisciplinary exhibition. Once again, I'm a librarian and Nuala is the scientist. And during this presentation, you may notice our different approaches and manners of communication. We wanted to put our skills and knowledge together to create something meaningful. And that led us to our third aim, which was to challenge the boundaries of botanical science within the context of capitalism, racism, and gender, and the role of museums within this entire structure. Being that we were at a botanical garden, our goal was to center the plants as a means to explore the experience of Black people in the United States. This goes for the library too, as with the garden and plants, we must highlight the library's collections. With that in mind, our aforementioned third aim was immediately validated when we started researching and dove into the library's extensive vertical file collection and discovered an empty vertical file labeled African American Scientist. And I do want to note, we in the library are actively working to fill this file now, so it is no longer empty. By starting with an acknowledgement of botanical science's relationship to colonial regimes, we were able to distill contemporary issues into stories to make people think about the paradox of the beauty of plants, the hidden pain and silenced voices, and the impact of humanity, or impact on humanity. In doing so, to attempt to bridge the present to the past. We wish to argue that plants are not bystanders in history, but shape history and how we humans view nature. To put it plainly, plants aren't neutral. Knowing that many museums are being forced to reckon with their colonial past and neocolonialism today, we brainstormed about the notable legacy of the ongoing cultural suppression, economic exploitation, anti-Black tropes, dispossession, and domination within American culture, which offered many avenues to explore the reuse and recycling of colonial tropes that resonate in today's culture. And once again, I want to point out that this was at the beginning of last year. This was before the Black Lives Matter movement was taken seriously in the public eye, before all the protests this summer. So I want you to look at all these names, remember the names, And I just want to say that this was not a reaction or response. Black lives have always mattered, and it didn't take a rough summer for us to say so. So why did we pick the plants we picked to do this exhibit? Initially, we wish to explore contemporary issues in pop culture through the lens of plants. For example, marijuana and the coca plant to examine incarceration system and law and plant taxonomy. Octavia Butler's relationship with indigenous plant knowledge to write her books looking at Afro-Indigenous synergies, Black astronauts sowing radish seeds in space, and the heart-shaped herb imbued with vibranium from the movie Black Panther. But if we aim to start a conversation about decolonizing botanical science, we needed to start with acknowledging the legacy of the history of botanical science and colonial histories, and how the absence of the Black experience perpetuates the ongoing exclusion of Black people within modern society by whitewashing history where racism, science, and colonial power were inherently entwined. And so, Black Botany was born. And I'm gonna hand it off to Nuala to get you started walking through the exhibit.
So it was really difficult to settle on the plants that we wanted to choose, as Rashad mentioned. And certainly there was like a plethora that we could have chosen, but we were restricted by the fact that at the library, which is what you're looking at right now, there was 5 windows, and that's why it had to be 5 plants. So I'm gonna start with the peacock flower. In a history and gender workshop I attended a few years back as I moved into being a historian of science, the historian at NYU, Michelle Mitchell, stated that Black women should never be a footnote in history. So we wish to have a plant to tell a story specifically about Black women. Black women have been ascribed every name possible, from hypersexualized to docile stereotypes, and to the ongoing trope of the angry Black woman. We wanted to challenge this notion through a very powerful and provocative story about Black women's own agency within the conditions of daily violence, humiliation, rape, and systematic abuse within the enslaved system. We wish to center Black women in a political economy that defined enslaved Black people through the language of agriculture and husbandry, as plantation owners sought to grow their investment in human bondage through encouraging reproduction with enslaved labor forces. We wished, I just have to move this wee slide forward, friends. Cool. We wished for our visitors to really think about 2 aspects of this plant, and that kind of was a thread throughout the whole thing with this exhibition, that when you look at this plant here, this beautiful plate, Celtipinia pulcherrima, commonly known as the peacock plant, produces these gorgeous, like kind of obnoxiously beautiful yellow and red blossoms. And they kind of emerge ethereally from leaves, right? This plant gets to 9 foot tall. So it's really actually hard to ignore the beauty of them. Yet within the history of this plant stands a story of great loss and violence. Knowing that the refusal to reproduce was both an illegal act in antebellum America, but also a political act, we wish to engage with the experience of enslaved Black women, and that moment they decided to ingest or drink the seeds of this plant. We wanted to elevate the sense of self for women who refused to concede or submit, even when defined by enslavers and society as subhuman, as property, as reproductive labor. We looked to Marian Sevilla. Marian, she's a 17th century artist. She was one of the first naturalists, or excuse me, of few naturalists who noted that plants abortifacient traits. And she tells us how she spoke to enslaved African and Indigenous populations in today's Suriname. She talks to them about the use of the peacock plant in their own traditional medicine to induce labor, miscarriages, abortion, or including suicide. The discomfort of this story is so glaringly real, it's easy to ignore. That plantation physicians actually noted abortion, along with cruelty, poor nourishment, and hard labor among the main causes of ill health and mortality of enslaved women, suggests that this knowledge of this sort of plant was an open secret. Everyone knew that it was going on, but no one really talked about it. Yet, as you know, privilege shapes knowledge dissemination. And the historian of science, Lynda Schieminger, has shown throughout her research, which is where we got our research from, on how The political and moral economy of slavery made abortifacient seem unnecessary to Europe's expanding drug trade empire, and particularly for women in Victorian society. The peacock flower was never going to build an empire, but a plant like cinchona, which you may have heard of, which is treated for malaria, certainly would. We hoped that visitors would contemplate the lives and experience of these women who are nameless, to provoke thoughts over what inducing a miscarriage or an abortion could mean. Was it an act of resistance? We don't really know. The desire for reproductive control, or perhaps an attempt to spare their unborn child from bondage. Or, as one New York Botanic Gardens teenager, he came in, he was an intern, suggested after he looked at this, he was about 17, and I'm sorry that I don't know his name, I don't recall it. After he viewed this, he said, maybe they weren't resisting, maybe these women were just submitting. And it was such a painful experience to hear him say that. Labor, both physical and reproduction, brings us to our second plant, the cotton. You all might know cotton. It is at the center of the most exploitative production complex in human history, slavery. Along with sugar, it is one of the most commonly associated with Black culture and enslavement. Plantations represent an incredibly transformational moment in human and natural history on a global scale. Cotton tells us about land, and land is a bedrock of power. And power today in land presents unequal concentration of land ownership. It reflects the extraction and movement of people from their homes and communities across the globe. You probably know this. We need land for everything, as homes, as food, as a source of energy. And in the colonial environment, landowning gave you rights and privileges that others could just not obtain. In an age of climate change where viable land is diminishing at incredibly astonishing rates, we wish to move beyond the aesthetics of botanical spaces and think about the political, social, and legal power structures that plants are actually firmly embedded with. Cotton plantations offer a really powerful reminder that environmental problems today can't really be decoupled at all from histories of racism, capitalism, science, and colonialism. And certainly this global shift in land has made some human beings across the globe much more vulnerable to climate change than others. Today we use this term called Anthropocene because humans love to center themselves to denote today's current geological age. So it's sort of defined as a period in which human activity is dominated by the influence of us on climate and environment. Yet plantations have not disappeared at all with colonial regimes. Historians Anna Singh, Donna Haraway, and Greg Mittman have argued that we rename this period the Plantationocene, as this approach to commodity products continues today. The existence of plantations today troubled the very whiteness of biodiversity conservation and environmentalism, as Black and Indigenous cultures around the globe struggle, for example, with food sovereignty. For this plant, we wish visitors to see how the very physical anatomy of this plant defined how enslavers approached and managed plantations. Because the bolls, that's the fluffy part. Let me just move forward so you can see. Excuse me. The bolls basically, as they begin to ripen for harvesting, they actually ripen from the lower to the upper stems. Enslavers managing these plantations thought that Black women and children in particular offered the best means to maximize harvesting output. So when they went to, inverted commas, the market to purchase enslaved Black people, it became a craft of scientific management standards where Black bodies were reduced to the plantation logic of output. Now that logic continues today in incredibly interesting and fascinating, awful ways, and continues to shape the distribution of capital and differential treatment of human life to this day. For example, the basketball player, LeBron James, during his HBO show, The Shop, I know what you're all thinking, you're like, what has LeBron James got to do with botany? You never expected that to come up, but here we are. He actually called out the slave mentality of old white men owning teams of Black bodies in the National Football League. When we were putting this together, And we were trying to figure out how to actually bring in some illustrations and herbarium specimens. We did go to the herbarium, and we got great help from the staff there, Laura and Nicole, thank you, to look and see what actually specimen we wanted to show. And it was really hard to ignore the sharpness of the pericarp or the wall of the cotton. It's really, really sharp. It's still sharp, even though some of these specimens are very old. And some of them were indeed collected in the pre-Civil War era. So this was very, very jarring to look at and take in. The library book collection at the gardens has plenty of literature on cotton, but usually from an agricultural focus, with plenty of images of Black people without identities. We tried to think of ways to bring this imagery into more recent present, and it was actually the director of the library, Susan, who knew of the seed cards that you're seeing on screen. This seed trade card is an example of the anti-Black representations that both reflected and shaped attitudes towards people of color in post-slavery America. We can definitely discuss these later. We have some more images to show you that didn't go on display, but it's one of the reasons why that actual display window is quite packed, because we really didn't want to lose that trade card. But later on, we can talk about that. I'm going to pass you over an imaginary Atlantic Ocean to Rashad.
Thank you. I'm going to tell you about some people, some specific people. Vanilla. Vanilla is the staple of cuisine, and Vanilla planifolia, the flower that produces it, is the only orchid of significant economic importance as an edible crop. There's a good chance you eat vanilla every day, and you should at least know the name of the 12-year-old enslaved boy that made that possible. The library's collections have numerous books on vanilla, but perhaps unsurprisingly, any of those that discuss the economic importance of the plant have only the briefest mention of Edmund, but his story is actually pretty interesting. Dare I say, you could make a movie out of it. Up until 1841, botanists had been unable to get the plant to fruit. It was in 1841 in the French colony of Reunion that Edmund showed his owner 2 vanilla beans hanging from a vine. Edmund explained that he had produced these fruits himself by hand pollination. He had invented a quick method to pollinate the vanilla orchid using a thin stick. He lifted part of the flower that separates the pollen from the stigma and smashed them together with his thumb. His owner wrote to other plantation owners telling them that Edmund had figured this out, and Edmund was sent from plantation to plantation to teach other enslaved people how to fertilize vanilla. And for this act, Edmund would become a free man and given a last name, Albius. And at the end of 1848, coincidentally, all enslaved people in Reunion were emancipated. Not so coincidentally, because he started the vanilla industry. And in most of these texts, this is where the story ends. The vanilla industry was born, it grew exponentially, and in 1848, Reunion was exporting 50 kilograms of vanilla, and 50 years later, they'd be exporting 200 tons. So people were making money, so they didn't need slaves anymore. But Edmund would never profit from this. Quote, for his role in making the vanilla industry, his former owner wrote to the governor on Edmund's behalf to request a cash stipend. He got no reply. Edmund would eventually fall in rough times and get mixed up in a jewelry heist. Again, his former owner would write to the governor to get Edmund released, citing that the vanilla industry is entirely due to him. This time he was successful. Now, if you know how things worked for Black people in those times, unsurprisingly, Edmund's troubles weren't over. A French botanist comes along and claims to have invented hand pollinizing vanilla and showing it to other horticulturists on Reunion, and that Edmund was supposedly in the room and stole his technique. Once again, his former owner writes on his behalf, this time to the Reunion's official historian, recognizing that Edmund was the one who discovered it and positing that if this other guy had discovered it, why was everyone sending a slave boy around to teach it? Mm-hmm. This letter was actually published and still exists and is part of Reunion's official history. Edmund then married and moved back to the plantation, lived his life and died at the age of 51, never making a cent from his discovery. 100 years later in 1980, a statue would be erected, there'd be a school in his name and a street. But names equate personhood, and even with his freedom and a last name, Edmund was unable to accomplish much, even when credited with the discovery. An article that I came across in my research said that Edmund had won because now we know his name, but I'm not exactly sure creating a multi-billion-dollar industry at the age of 12, never profiting from it, leading a hard life, and dying at the age of 51 is exactly a victory. But now you know the name Edmund Albius. And another name you might know is, I wish I had some music going behind me. I'm going to try and have some fun with this. The boy who was traded for a horse, AKA young plant doctor, the Black Leonardo, Columbus of the soil, God's ebony scientist. That's right, the peanut man himself, George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver is a Black History Month staple. Thanks, Nuala, for laughing. I hope some other people on the other end of this are entertained. I'm sure if you guys had some form of Black History Month education, he was one of the first individuals you learned about, probably with something like, did you know a Black man invented peanut butter? But because of that, his association with peanuts is deeply ingrained. Our idea of George Washington Carver in this exhibit was similar to Cotton. We wanted to take someone familiar and closely associated with Black history and show that in Carver's case, he was much more than the peanut man, and to challenge his idea and his tokenizing historical position. To do that, we have to start with his association to peanuts. Carver became synonymous with peanuts when he wrote the bulletin, How to Grow the Peanut and 105 Ways of Preparing It for Human Consumption, and presenting to Congress on behalf of the United Peanut Association of America so that they could get a protective tariff against China. In doing that, he spoke for hours, showing different uses of peanuts that included peanut butter, but this was only in the middle of his career. Carver produced 43 other bulletins to teach poor Black farmers how to grow crops that would improve their quality of life and show them techniques to revitalize soil that was depleted from repeated plantings of cotton. We learn about Carver not only because he was successful, but for Black Americans, he was proof of the value of education. Carver himself had a strong desire to learn and further his education, and that resulted in him earning both his bachelor's and master's degree from Iowa State Agricultural School. This is where Carver would initially pursue, this is where I would say, excuse me. Carver initially pursued a degree in education himself, studying art and piano. He was a bit of a Renaissance man, as you can see the pictures of him painting, but he was actually encouraged by other teachers to pursue agriculture because of his botanical knowledge. So, in graduating from Iowa State, he became the first Black faculty member, but was enticed away by Booker T. Washington to come to the Tuskegee Institute. And to entice him, Washington started his own agricultural school, kind of making Carver indispensable because he was the only Black person qualified to lead an all-Black agricultural school. But Carver was not just a talented botanist, which intensified the attention he would receive. He was a Black botanist. Due to his educational connections and presentations, he was celebrated in the political sphere. He essentially became the Black friend for a lot of powerful and connected white men. He and FDR had regular correspondence. FDR was supposedly a big fan of his work and appreciated his polio treatment using peanut oil. Henry Ford invited him to speak at a conference where they supposedly became friends. Carver also traveled around to promote racial unity, and it would become more well-known. His celebrity got conflated, of course, with peanuts, which would push him from the Black friend trope to one of my favorites, magical Negro. And if you're not familiar with magical Negro trope, that's the old Black person who shows up at the right time and just happens to have answers to life problems. Because being in the public eye only led to Carver being misrepresented for other political agendas. In the media, he was, as I mentioned earlier, not going to get hype and yellow. The boy who was traded for a horse, or Black Leonardo, the Columbus of the soil, and God's ebony scientist. For many white Americans, Carver was proof that Black people could prosper without actively changing the underlying social structure. They built a legend around him, fitting him into a white framework, because as we all know, Columbus didn't discover anything, and Carver was prolific in his inventions and innovations. When asked in 1938 if his work with peanuts was his best, Carver answered no, but it was featured more than my other work. Carver, as a scientist and artist, remained focused on enabling Black Americans to succeed. His belief in the value of education and the idea that Black people could prosper and are not counter to one another, as shown with the story of rice.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rice plant, just to kind of set up why we put this in the exhibition. The main goal for exhibiting this plant was really to push against the stereotype that white people are intellectually superior to Black people, especially with regards to highbrow endeavors like STEM topics. We utilized the book Black Rice by the historian Judith Kearney, and we wish for visitors to think about the contribution of enslaved Black women, men, and children to the agricultural and horticultural history of the United States, and assert that these groups of people, these cultures, were not blank slates coming over on which Europeans could build their civilizations on. The development of African rice plantations in the United States is actually a story of transfer and circulation of knowledge and African agency. Unlike other plantation crops, rice was a crop that West African farmers already had been cultivating way long before European seafarers reached the coast of Africa in the 15th century. That rice was able to grow in the southern states was not due to white excellence, but the tacit knowledge of enslaved people who knew how to cultivate rice in sort of wetter lowland regions and tidal floodplains, to think about the Carolinas. And it required knowledge of technological sophistication and tremendous input of labor. Clearing swampy land for rice cultivation takes skills that need to be passed on generationally. As we sort of come to a close, rice sort of sets up kind of really one of the main thrusts of our exhibition, which is about who gets to tell stories and make stories, which is about access. We hope that visitors to the exhibition can see that the plants in these stories and plants en masse are not backdrops to the drama of history, but are deeply entangled in the conscious intellectual mission of Black excellence. I'm going to hand it over to Rashad to talk a little tiny bit, because I know we're running out of time, about decolonizing museums. And then we'll move on to the question and answers. Go ahead, Rashad.
Thank you. So I don't have answers to what to do about decolonizing museums, but I'm going to pose a number of questions for people to think about. I will say that awareness is key. So with that in mind, first question you got to ask is, why do museums exist? Why does, in any specific museum or institution, why does it exist? In business speak, what is their mission? Can you hit my slide? There we go. And so just to give a quick example, we have the mission statement from the Met. And if you notice, the first thing they say is to collect. Now, if you're collecting for the sake of collecting, and then you're studying and conserving and presenting significant works of art, you're defining what's significant and you're influencing that culture. We'll look at New York Botanical Gardens statement, NYBG. They are there to advocate for the plant kingdom. And then they explain how they do that throughout with the rest of their mission. And subsequently, the Mertz Library, and I'm a little biased because I work there, promotes intelligent stewardship of the natural world. And I really like the phrase intelligent stewardship because that shows thoughtfulness. And then it leads into collecting and preserving. But to continue with the questions, what does it mean to decolonize? It may be an obvious statement, but many museums have legacies rooted in colonialism. Where are your collections from? How are they obtained? What culture do they represent? And what are they communicating? What culture are you perpetuating internally and externally? Sharing authority, who are you sharing authority for these, for the interpretation of these items? Like if you've gotten them from another culture, are you engaging with that culture to interpret? Where is the museum located? How do they interact with the surrounding area? And how are all these questions incorporated into your strategic plan? Your board and donors, who are they and what is their influence and level of control? And going back to the strategic plan, if you do incorporate those things, how is it all defined? What's the bare minimum when recognizing all this stuff? Is it land acknowledgements? Is it changing your hiring practices? Is it diverse hiring? Is it outreach? Is it interpretation? How are you addressing the items in your collection? For example, the library books, when we have stuff that's maybe questionable or offensive, we include book reviews that kind of recognize their historical significance. As far as hiring practices go, a lot of places cite, lack of a diverse hiring pool, but what is their role in that and how can they encourage more diverse applicants? And are they, beyond doing that, just interviewing diverse candidates for the sake of saying they interviewed someone? What is the environment like for people of color? Here I was actually going to use BIPOC, but I thought about it and kind of realized that that phrase is a little bit othering because when you're grouping a bunch of people together, that is othering. So I don't have a suggestion for how to replace that phrase, but I've decided I'm not a fan of it. Is your workplace welcoming and attractive? With that, a lot of people experience microaggressions in the day-to-day. What does a microaggression look like to you? What do you consider that? A lot of people, my name is Rashad, and a lot of people get my name wrong. I don't know how, it's 6 letters, it's not that hard. People get my name wrong very often. So, at some point I figure, if you can't learn my name, what's going on? I take that as a microaggression. Assuming that people of color are not on staff, or, there have been times when I've been assumed to have been an intern at best. Like, the classic, you're so well-spoken or articulate. Being ignored by staff and patrons. Like I said, I work in the library. Sometimes I have to work the library desk. There have been people who will walk right past me and into my white colleague's office, only to then be escorted out and told to talk to me, that I'm the librarian on duty. And because of these uncomfortable workplaces, many people of color are starting to do their own thing and creating their own spaces. This exhibit is an example of working to change the environment. Not to say that was explicitly our goal, as we've talked about earlier, but that's with the way institutions work, sometimes they won't see the value of something until they see the response to it. And a lot of places are starting up, DEI committees and things like that. Do those work? I really think only if people feel comfortable participating in them. And, a lot of places get caught up in their services and strategies, and it becomes a lot of talk. One thing I'm not hearing a lot of is anti-racism. How are you incorporating that into your strategy? Because a lot of people end up feeling tokenized and isolated. How are you interacting with your staff, with your community, and the world at large? You know, once again, you are a cultural institution. You have to consider these things. But I do want to say that this is bigger than HR. That's because this goes through every level of life. To change as a society, these institutions that represent our society need to change to be an example. Don't be afraid, and we all have to challenge our inherent bias. And like I said, awareness is key.
So as we wind down, we'll leave this slide up for just a few seconds to say, just to follow on what Rashad said, is to like stay curious, ask questions, just like continually ask questions. This project took so many people to make this happen, and we'd like to just acknowledge a whole bunch of people before we start the question and answers. So we'd like to thank Vanessa Sellers at the Humanities Institute, at the Gardens, and the Mertz Library team, Susan Fraser, Lauren McKinney, Samantha DeCunto, Kelty Miller, Olga Marden, Stephen Sinan, and the Steere Herbarium team, Nicole Tarnowski and Laura Briscoe. Second, I would like to thank, I feel like I'm doing an Oscar speech here. I would like to thank my amazing advisors at NYU and the American Museum of Natural History. And additionally, a big, huge thank you to the Atlantic History Workshop at NYU. Lastly, I would like to thank my co-curator, Rashad, for being so open to working with an Irish woman. And of course, teaching me how to dance and shoot hoops. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuala. Yeah, big thank you to my co-curator, Nuala, not only for teaching me how to read and getting them to believe that one day I too could make it out of the hood, but also for running with this idea and making it more than just a conversation. I want to give a big thank you to Wambui and DePrater, two amazing Black women, for their warmth and encouragement. And I just want to say thank you to every Black person that has come before me. Everything they've done is so that I can do what I do. And to every Black person out there living your life, thank you for being you.
So just a wee FYI, please put the questions into the actual question and answer button rather than adding questions into the chat. I always add it into the chat and then no one ever actually says it. So we'd appreciate that. And if there is some question that like you thought was like awesome, just like kick it up by like giving it a thumbs up vote. All right. So I'm just going to open up the questions. Rashad, do you want to dance while I get the questions up?
No, I taught you how to dance so that you could handle this part.
I'm Irish. We get distracted by other things. Okay, so Rashad, we actually have a really great question here. It's a nice softball question to get us going. So what other plants would we want to have included in this thinking? So go ahead, Rashad. Go for it.
Oh, no, we could tag team this one, but yeah. Like we mentioned at the beginning, marijuana was a big one, the coca plant, tobacco is one I wanted to work in as well as sugar cane. These are all big parts of our society. Nuala, any others you want to mention that weren't mentioned?
Yeah, I definitely think that we sort of wanted to use plants to really extend into other avenues. Like we would want to look at certain plants that are used in Afrofuturism and in sort of science fiction. And a lot of them sort of were, some of them were imaginary and some of them were not, but we could actually kind of connect them to plants that were in the herbarium. I really wanted to talk about marijuana because plant taxonomy is so deeply embedded in actually the legal structures of what's considered marijuana or not. And certainly taxonomists at the Gardens, and I'm sure in other places across the world, were actually brought in to court to testify what a species was, whether it was weed or not. So awesome. All right, so here's a question These are great questions, and we definitely won't get through them all, but we'll try. Okay. So in earlier centuries, women shut out of the art world turned to botanical art. That's very true. Did Black artists also, and are there any Black botanical artists we should be aware of? This is a great question, and I'll be honest, I don't know. This is part of, oh, somebody's going to answer the question live, so that's awesome. One of the things we were trying to figure out was whether to actually elevate Black botanists or not. Like, so we have Carver and we have Edmund, but one of the reasons we also kind of had to choose what we actually ended up choosing was because of the time constraints. We only had 3 weeks to put this together. So we were very conscious that we would rather get something up and running for Black History Month than kind of spend time researching stuff. So I hope that answers your question. Rashad, what do you think about Western herbaria sending type specimens back to the land the specimen was collected from?
Oh, wow.
Your answer is going to define what happens these specimens.
Yeah, well, as I'm a librarian and, I don't work in an herbarium, my view is like an understanding of collecting is that it's kind of for an understanding and, view of the collection and study. So I don't think it's necessary personally to have to send them back as long as they are acknowledged and properly cataloged. Like if a specimen is lacking, that's another issue. Like if that specimen is not in the area where it's been collected from. And also I think it's worth like we talked about earlier, acknowledging not just where it was collected, but how it was collected.
And I'm just going to piggyback on that really quickly. I think one of the things is that when you go into a herbarium space or any space with collections, there is a sort of assumption that everything is sort of cataloged, that we know it's in there and we know so much information about it. And that's not true. And there's various reasons for that. One of them is usually to do with staffing issues, right? That funding doesn't necessarily go to the collections. So sometimes we just don't even know what's in there. But I definitely agree with Rashad that if something is of a particular nature that is the type specimen, if somebody wants it back, it should be definitely a conversation that's very actively engaged with. I have some really quick questions because we're down to the wire with time. So Rashad, are you ready for these? Go back and forth. So a certain woman named Prater just said, is there a part 2? We don't know.
It would be nice. Maybe. We'll see.
Maybe. Is this our interview for doing a part 2? There's just some questions about sharing the presentation. Sorry, I'm just gonna go down.
Well, I do see this one at top. Someone's interested in knowing how we treat sensitive text or pictures for display.
Yeah. Please read that out. Go for it.
Yeah, well, we really wanted to kind of put that stuff on display, kind of to really recognize, so we didn't want to shy away from it. Some of the more challenging stuff, though, you couldn't find ways to incorporate. Like one of the more interesting things we did come across was there was a book on cotton when we were researching cotton that mentioned how do you talk to your Negro now that they're free? How do you convince them to work for you and keep them happy? We didn't get to incorporate that, but we really wanted to show these powerful things.
So, quick question: what did George Washington Carver consider as his more important work than peanuts?
That's actually also hard to say. I think he was pretty proud of the Jessup wagon, but he didn't keep a lot of notes. Well, first, the Jessup wagon was a wagon that was used to be a mobile classroom to go to farm, but he didn't keep a lot of notes and he didn't file a lot of patents. He was kind of a person that was all about just doing the work. So it's hard to say what he was most proud of.
Yeah, I get the impression that from what we read, that he was just super proud of the fact that he could produce so much work that actually benefited his, Black culture. That was certainly the impression I got from his work. I have a quick question. As a person interested, not me, but the person in this question, as a person interested in educating today's youth, I wonder what the best ways are to end the whitewashing of science and to promote BIPOC history in all areas of science, especially from a young age. This is a question that's something that I'm trying to tackle with when I teach, and certainly in my own research. I think it's kind of like the Peacock Flower. It's about like looking at both sides of the stories and in a way not being afraid to kind of say the stories and allow students of any age to grapple with these issues. One of the things that I find really interesting is how science is perceived, and particularly when I came to the States as a scientist, I don't think I've ever had people faint when I told them I was a scientist. I couldn't get over it. Like back in Ireland, it was like, yeah, whatever, like, go get a drink. Like there was nothing like as sort of, it's so elevated here. And I found that fascinating. I think that the only way to tackle whitewashing is to discuss it and allow students to kind of make an opinion and change their opinion on it. What do you think, Rashad?
I think representation is hugely important. You have to show kids that there are people that look like them that do these jobs. You have to also just challenge the idea by asking them, what does a scientist look like? That is one of the reasons I incessantly say I'm a librarian, because I know a lot of people have the bias that a librarian is a white woman, and I'm neither of those things.
Yeah. We have lots of amazing questions about whether there's a catalog and whether this is being recorded, so it will be available, and just tons and tons of amazing questions. And unfortunately, we are running out of time. We're a minute down. So we know that the education team will collate all these questions, and certainly we'll try and figure out a way to try and be able to make that maybe with the recording that we can answer your questions. I want to very quickly thank everybody for spending the evening with us and taking time out of your day. I'm going to pass it on to Rashad. First, we'll just wave goodbye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you
so much.